The ultimate strategic vulnerability is food security. Now let's talk about why. Every durable civilization mastered food sovereignty. Ancient Egypt tamed the Nile's annual flood cycle. Rome fed its million-strong capital by conquering Sicily, then Egypt, and then North Africa. China's dynasties lived or died by flood control and vast granaries. Even the United States rose as a superpower partly because it could feed itself abundantly and export the surplus. But why agriculture? If you think about it, agriculture is your calorie supply, it's your economic backbone, your buffer against crisis. It's the charge in the battery that is civilization. When the surpluses disappear, the whole system weakens. The civilizations that last don't just grow food, they master food sovereignty. They protect arable land, preserve the farming knowledge they've acquired, and refuse dangerous dependencies. And this mastery of agriculture didn't happen by accident. It's intertwined with the development of humanity. Around 12,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution, the first agricultural revolution, changed everything. Humans shifted from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, domesticating wheat, barley, rice, and animals. For the first time, surpluses created permanent villages, population growth, cities, specialization, and the birth of more complex civilizations such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and Rome. Later waves amplified the power. The Second Agricultural Revolution, which happened around the 17th to 19th centuries, brought crop rotation, selective breeding, and mechanization, feeding exploding urban populations. The Green Revolution, which happened around the mid-20th century, introduced high-yield seeds, fertilizers, and irrigation, dramatically boosting output, helping avert famines in Asia and Latin America, and allowing the global population to more than double. But is agriculture really that important today? Yes. Yes, it is. Today, food security seems obvious. Globalization obscures the danger lurking. We import cheap calories and assume that these supply chains are immortal. Yet the ongoing war in Ukraine and the escalating conflict involving Iran reminds us how fragile this supply chain really is. In 2025 to 2026, Russian strikes on Black Sea ports, energy infrastructure, and ships have repeatedly disrupted grain flows. And this is wheat, corn, and sunflower oil that once fed millions in Africa and the Middle East. Exports have run 20 to 30% lower in key period. Prices have spiked in waves, and surplus grain has sat stranded while attacks continue. Even with the adapted routes, the volatility shows that in prolonged conflict, control over the harvest can still decide who eats and who doesn't. At the same time, military escalation in the Middle East has severely disrupted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point carrying roughly 1/3 of global seaborne fertilizer trade. With spring planting season now underway in the northern hemisphere, backup of urea and ammonia and other key inputs has already driven fertilizer prices sharply higher. Farmers now face higher costs and potential shortages exactly when they need them most. But let's look at history to see what happens when societies lose control of its ability to feed its population. Case study 1. Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. Ideology over pragmatism. By the turn of the century, Zimbabwe stood at crossroads. The country had inherited a dual agricultural structure from the Rhodesian era, a highly productive commercial farming sector, which was mostly white-owned, capital-intensive, and export-oriented. This generated reliable surpluses of maize, beef, and tobacco, as well as other crops, while feeding both domestic needs and regional markets. Rhodesia had earned its reputation as Africa's breadbasket through skilled irrigation, mechanization, soil management, and institutional knowledge, things that were built over the colonial era for decades. But post-independence governments had long promised to address the colonial era land imbalances. But in the early 2000s, under mounting political pressure and after losing a key referendum, the ruling party shifted from gradual compensated reform to a fast-track program that placed ideology firmly ahead of pragmatism. The fast-track land reforms began with widespread farm invasions in 2000. Skilled commercial farms, thousands of them representing the backbone of large-scale production, were seized, often violently and with little or no compensation. War veterans and ruling party militia occupied the farms, intimidating, assaulting, and in some cases even killing the owners. Reports documented that at least 7 to 10 farmers were killed during the invasions, along with beatings, tortures, and grapes targeting farmers' families and workers. Black farm workers also suffered assaults, displacement, and killings when they resisted or were caught in the chaos. Police frequently failed to intervene. Land was then redistributed rapidly to new owners, many of whom were politically connected but lacked commercial farming experience, capital, or the technical know-how to maintain intensive operations. Property rights were effectively nullified overnight. Titles lost value. Banks could no longer use farmland as collateral, and credit dried up across the sector. To some, not me, but others, this was viewed as a bold corrective step, a way to empower the majority and break the old racial structure of agriculture. But the long-term risks associated with the ideology over the pragmatism are still felt today in Zimbabwe. The irrigation systems quickly fell into disrepair without the expertise or investment to maintain dams, pumps, and canals. Institutional knowledge, the accumulated practical wisdom of crop rotation, soil conservation, pest management, and market networks, walked away with the experienced farmers who fled the country in large numbers. Production in key commercial sectors collapsed. Maize output, the staple food, dropped sharply. Overall, agricultural production in many staples fell by around 60% within a decade. Commercial farmland lost an estimated 3/4 of its value almost overnight, wiping out billions in equity and triggering a broader credit crunch. What had once been a net exporter of food became a nation facing chronic shortages. During droughts, even the old commercial system had buffered through irrigation and reserves. The country declared repeated national disasters and turned to heavy imports and international aid. A country that once helped feed the region now struggled to feed itself, with recurring food insecurity affecting millions. The Zimbabwe example matters because the state had essentially prioritized rapid ideological redistribution over the pragmatic requirements of food sovereignty. Secure property rights, skill to management, capital investment, continuity of expertise, and basic physical security on the land. When central authority tolerated or even encouraged violence and dismantled the existing agricultural system without viable replacements in place, the strategic stomach failed. Output didn't just dip. The entire system of surpluses, resilience, and leverage eroded. The pattern is clear. When ideology overrides the mechanical realities of soil, water, knowledge, incentives, and security, even a once productive breadbasket can empty fast. Case study 2. The Irish potato famine, monoculture, and policy failure. For the opposite extreme, Ireland faced deadly over-reliance on a narrow agricultural base combined with external colonial control and ideological policy blindness. In the early 1840s, Ireland's population had surged past 8 million, one of the highest densities in Europe at the time. Much of this growth rested on a single introduced crop, the potato. A New World import, the potato delivered enormous caloric output even on tiny marginal plots of poor soil. It allowed small tenant families to survive and reproduce on holdings as small as 1 or 2 acres. By the 1840s, roughly 1/3 to half the population depended almost entirely on the potato for sustenance, while the rest of Irish agriculture, grain, livestock, and dairy, was largely oriented toward export markets. For a time, it looked like a pragmatic adaptation. More mouths could still be fed without massive disruption to the export economy, but it carried profound risks rooted in monoculture vulnerability and structural fragility. When potato blight, caused by a fungus-like pathogen, struck in the autumn of 1845, it destroyed up to half the crop that year and 3/4 or more in the more subsequent seasons. The blight spread rapidly across damp Irish fields, turning tubers into black, rotting sludge almost overnight. Because so many families grew almost nothing else, the failure of the single pillar triggered immediate catastrophe. British colonial policies made the disaster even worse. Ireland continued exporting large quantities of grain, livestock, butter, and other high-value foods to Britain throughout the famine years. Food that should have stayed in Ireland. Rigid land tenancy systems left most Irish as subsistence smallholders with no savings, no diversified crops, and no legal security. Eviction for non-payment of rent was common, even as people starved. Relief efforts under successive governments were slow, limited, and heavily shaped by laissez-faire economic ideology. Public work schemes such as building roads and ditches were prioritized over direct food aid. Imported maize was often unpalatable or insufficient, and soup kitchens only reached peak scale briefly in 1847 before being wound down. The result was one of the worst demographic collapses in 19th century Europe. Roughly 1 million people died from starvation and famine-related diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and cholera between 1845 and 1852. Another million or more emigrated, many in overcrowded coffin ships where diseases claimed further lives, with total emigration during the famine years exceeding 2 million, when including those heading to Britain and elsewhere. Ireland's population, which should have approached 9 million by 1851, under normal growth, fell to about 6.5 million. Some regions lost 20 to 67% of their people. The Irish potato famine example matters because the society had essentially built its demographic and economic expansion on one fragile agricultural pillar while exporting the surplus calories produced on better land. When nature attacked that single point of failure and colonial policy refused to prioritize local food security over market principles and rent collection, the strategic stomach failed catastrophically. A population that had grown rapidly on monoculture and external control lost millions and never fully recovered its pre-famine trajectory. The lesson is unmistakable. When a civilization outsources resilience, whether through dangerous specialization or distant ideological priorities, even abundant-looking systems can collapse the moment the narrow base is struck. Now, what does this all mean? I'm not here to deliver a long rant. The video's already covered plenty of ground. What I want you to take away is this. Food security must remain a consistent, top-tier policy consideration. Now, I'm not arguing against globalization. Trade and specialization bring real benefits, but when a civilization becomes dependent on others for its food, its fertilizer, or its critical inputs, it sacrifices something fundamental. True sovereignty requires the ability to feed your own people, even in a crisis. You cannot fully defend what you cannot sustain. History is littered with examples. Wars won not by superior armies alone, but by raised crops, severed supply lines, and plagues that swept through the fields. We often tell the story of human progress through technology, grand conflicts, and economic power. Yet the earliest foundations of every civilization were built on this one simple reality: what we needed to survive and thrive. If you cannot feed yourself, you will inevitably rely on others. And as the old adage warrants, you should never bite the hand that feeds. Closing. Thanks for tuning in. This is part 2 of the new series I'm working on, the 7 Pillars of Sovereignty. I also apologize, I'm a little under the weather last night. There was a thunderstorm, and I said, ooh, let me open the window to hear it. I woke up with a cold. Anyways, if you want to watch the first video, that was the pillar of demographics, why understanding population control is so important for civilizations. Now, if you found this valuable, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon. I won't spam you with shorts, you'll only get notifications when full-length videos drop. Thanks for watching, and have a good one. Oh, fuck, man.